The federal government operates thousands of social media accounts. These include hundreds of agency-wide, office, and program-specific accounts. They are on well-known social media networks such as Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. They're also on dozens of other social media platforms like Instagram and Flickr, GitHub, Vimeo, and even Foursquare. These accounts are used daily to engage with the public. They announce programs, they advertise federal vacancies, they announce benefits programs and contract opportunities. They also create a window into the day-to-day workings of the federal government. Social media is in fact often the primary, if not only means by which the federal government speaks to the public. If you want to know about virus prevention work at the CDC, where NASA has landed its most recent rover, or who is subject to fraud charges by the SEC or DOJ, or even whether the Administrative Conference of the United States is hiring, it isn't the agency website, the press release, or TV interview that most people are going to, but rather they go to the agency's social media accounts. Given the prevalence of these accounts, it is inevitable that the ethics issues will arise. Endorsements of company products, accidental or not, inadvertent posting of advertisements, tweeting political messages. These issues and others are not theoretical. They have all happened in the last few years. Avoiding these ethical missteps is no simple task. So today, we are joined by two attorneys from OG's Ethics Law and Policy Branch to discuss ethics issues that come up with the use and misuse of social media accounts and the steps that agency ethics officials can take to avoid these issues in the first place. First, I would like to introduce Assistant Counsel Christy Chung. Christy has worked at OGE for the past 3.5 years. She also sits on the board of GSA's Social Media Community of Practice. The Community of Practice is a government community of digital managers and communication specialists who work to research, evaluate, and implement emerging social technologies and strategies to help the public understand and access government services. Next, I'm happy to introduce Senior Associate Counsel Chris Schwartz. Chris's work at OGE focuses on, among other things, the intersection of new technologies and the ethics rules. And he was one of the primary authors on OGE's 2015 legal advisory concerning personal social media use. To begin with, we should note that on January 30th of this year, OGE published a legal advisory on official social media, OGE Legal Advisory 23-03. So to get us started, Chris, could you maybe help us understand what motivated this advisory?
Yeah, absolutely. And Patrick, I'm so glad we have a chance to speak about this topic. In one word, risk. As you said, agencies have thousands of social media accounts. Those are organizational, they may be office level, they may even be keyed into a specific individual. And they allow for direct access to the public, provision of information on real-time basis. But that also means that there is no filter between what is being published and when it's getting out to the public. And that can result in a very low margin of error. So what we wanted to do with this legal advisory is to provide agency ethics officials with some tools and some ways to engage with their digital management practitioners to try to avoid some of those risks before they come to fruition. And it shouldn't be a surprise. The ethics community has been very engaged in this area since 2015, and we've gotten a large number of questions and continued interest from the ethics community on this area. So we wanted to be able to meet that need as well.
That makes complete sense to me. So the legal advisory has just come out. And of course, that's the culmination of a lot of work, probably months of work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And in fact, years of work. As you know, we've been engaged with social media issues since 2015 when we wrote our personal social media legal advisory that focused on the application of the standards of conduct to activities that employees take on their personal and private social media. But even at that time, we were thinking about what are some of the types of risks that can occur when officials use social media in an official as opposed to personal capacity. It is an area that we have always wanted to return to, but we felt that it was necessary for us to watch developments in the field before we took it up. That doesn't mean that we haven't been focused on social media for the past 8 years. We've produced 3 legal advisories in that period of time, including one dealing with when social media mutual funds qualify as sector funds. One on crowdfunding, which is either done over a dedicated social media platform or over a general or traditional social media platform, as well as one that was done just a couple of years ago relating to a program that an agency wanted to put together where individuals, employees would be using their private accounts to engage in some official-like activity. And we wanted to highlight some of the risks that might accrue both to the employee and to the agency when that type of thing happens, as well as we've had quite a number of conversations with our friends in the ethics community and in the digital manager community. As you said earlier, Christy sits on the social media community of practice board. We've also done presentation there for them about the ethics rules and how it intersects with the work that they're doing on a daily basis. We've been very involved with the ethics community over the last few years. We've had hashtag compliance session at our 2020 Ethics Summit. We've had one-on-one training programs at HHS, DOJ, at the National Defense University. So we've been very engaged in this, but really we've been engaged as a learner, trying to understand where we can do the best impact and really help agency ethics officials.
So it sounds like you took a very careful wait-and-see approach before putting out written guidance, trying to gain some experience before issuing anything formal that everyone can rely on is more permanent in its nature.
Exactly. This is an evolving and fairly complex area. And what is considered appropriate official action is not often going to depend solely or even primarily on what the ethics rules say. Now, these are oftentimes focused on what individuals do personally or in ways to ensure that the government is operating with the highest levels of propriety and integrity. Trying to figure out when a post is appropriate or not, when engagement through social media is appropriate or not, is something that actually requires an analysis of a significant number of different laws, everything from the Anti-Deficiency Act to the Paperwork Reduction Act to the Information Quality Act, anti-covert propaganda laws. It's a real quiver of laws that you have to think about, and ethics really kind of makes up one slim part of that, as well as you know, agencies that have different missions, they have different program responsibilities, they have different sizes, and they have different people doing the type of work that we talk about as being digital management. And that means that everybody has a slightly different fit. So we wanted to be very mindful and learn from that experience before we started to give advice. And quite honestly, even in the ethics area, as you know, a lot of these questions are going to be specific to the circumstances at hand, and they're going to require and best be solved at the local level. So we didn't want to jump into an area without understanding how we could be helpful to agency ethics practitioners and understand where the trends were when it came to questions that fell within the ethics realm.
Oh, great. Thanks, Chris. That background on how the advisory developed is really interesting. To you, Christy, I'm interested in the substance of the opinion as well, and maybe you could share with us which legal issues OGE elected to address and how you selected those, how you came upon the legal issues that were important for us to think about.
Sure, of course. For the too long did not read yet folks out there, the legal advisory provides guidance on 3 topics in relation to official social media use. You have 1, official accounts as government property, 2, endorsement considerations, and 3, application of the criminal conflict of interest law at 18 U.S.C. section 208 to various common activities that employees participate in while using official accounts. In preparing this advisory, we really took under careful advisement the types of questions that we've gotten over the years, specific feedback that we received from the 20 or so agencies with whom we shared a preliminary draft of this advisory. And we also took into consideration some of the real life, ripped from the headlines examples of issues that we've seen come up over the years. Ultimately, the topics that we address in this advisory are those that we felt were most ripe for OGE clarification at this point in time, in light of the experience that we've gained over the years and in light of these various considerations at play.
Excellent, that's really helpful. Maybe we could start by breaking things down a little bit. Could we start with a discussion about how official accounts function as government property and why you thought this was an important area to start with in the advisory?
Sure. At the outset of the advisory, we do note that all official accounts are government property. This holds true for both organizational accounts that are under an agency's name or the name of a program or component, as well as for individual accounts that agencies may create for use by specific office holders. We know that individual specific accounts can sometimes be a source of consternation between agencies and employees, in the sense that employees who have accounts that were specifically created for them may sometimes feel a sense of ownership over those accounts, or they may feel as though they have broad latitude in deciding what gets posted on those accounts and how to use those accounts. We felt it was important to explicitly make clear that all official accounts are property of the government because of the ways in which this will provide support to agencies. This is a concrete fact that agencies can use to help establish and manage employee expectations vis-a-vis how all official accounts are to be used. Also, the fact that all official accounts are property of the government is the exact reason why we encourage agencies to, one, have policies in place that clearly scope what the authorized uses of those accounts are for employees, and two, have procedures in place that will help employees safeguard these government assets from unauthorized use.
I think that makes a lot of sense to me. So one of the big takeaways here, it sounds like, is government accounts are government property and should be managed as such. I think that's a fairly straightforward lesson that the ethics community can take away. From what I know about endorsements, which I know is another interesting area, I imagine that's not such a cut and dry analysis process. So maybe you could walk us through how we should look at those issues.
Sure. So questions relating to endorsement considerations are among the most common that we've received in relation to official social media use. And we've also all seen instances in which the public and news outlets have picked up on and commented on perceived violations of the endorsement rule by government officials. Part of the reason it's been difficult to issue guidance on this topic is because the endorsement analysis is highly fact-specific. What we've done is provide agencies with a general framework that they can take and apply to the various scenarios that will arise during the course of their day-to-day operations. Also, being in the business of prevention, the framework that we prescribe is one that, if adopted, can help agencies prevent impermissible endorsements upstream before they occur. Having said that, and to directly answer your question, Patrick, the general endorsement rule, as many of our viewers will know, is that employees may not use their government position, title, or any authority associated with their office for the endorsement of any product, service, or enterprise, unless one of the two regulatory exceptions apply. For the purposes of this discussion, I'm not going to get into the exceptions to the general rule, but if any of our viewers are curious, they are located in our regulations at 5 CFR section 2635.702C, and they can also be found in the advisory itself. In terms of how the endorsement rule applies, Patrick, you're an integral member of OGE's own communications team. I know you have firsthand knowledge of the multitude of ways in which agencies can share content and interact with other users while on official accounts. What we say in the advisory is that while employees are engaged in activities such as sharing, liking, linking to, or otherwise referencing content created by external organizations, employees need to be mindful of whether these references could reasonably be construed as an endorsement. Because if the answer is yes, then that content should either qualify for one of the regulatory exceptions or it shouldn't be posted at all.
No, thank you. That's very helpful. The question of whether an activity or a piece of content could reasonably be construed as an endorsement seems like one that's relatively easy to pose, but maybe not always easy to answer. So for employees like me who are sometimes on the front lines building their agency's social media presence, do you have any tips for us how to help us navigate these challenging issues?
Yeah, I'd say that's a very fair point, Patrick, and yes, I do. As a initial starting point, we recommend considering how the proposed content would look from an outside perspective. Would a member of the public view that content and see it as a endorsement? From a risk management standpoint, because the line between endorsement and mere reference can be very narrow, we encourage agencies to either incorporate limits on references to non-governmental products, service, and enterprises in their social media policies, or have a process in place for reviewing such references in order to ensure that employees are receiving support in making these decisions, and in order to ensure that employees are not making impermissible endorsements on official accounts. The advisory also includes a number of examples through which we explore the practical application of the endorsement rule to several common fact patterns, and agencies may find those examples to be helpful as well. I will say, from serving on the board of GSA's social media community of practice, and from having the opportunity to work directly with digital managers and communicators, I know how much of a gray area the topic of endorsements can be for employees who are on the front lines. To that end, I think that there's a opportunity for ethics officials to proactively reach out and engage with their agency's communication staff in the event that they're not already doing so.
I think that's a great point and a great suggestion to everyone listening, is that if you don't have relationships with the people who are involved in this work, you should let them know that you exist and you're willing to help. I really like that suggestion, and I hope people take it very seriously. I'd like to turn back to you, please, Chris. We heard a little bit about the endorsements and the standards of conduct issues. Do we ever need to think about the criminal laws when we're looking at official use of social media?
Well, let's be honest, Patrick. Anytime we're doing something in our official capacity, it could pose a conflict of interest if you have a financial interest in that decision. And so the answer is yes, it may be less likely. And, the legal advisory discusses some of the core cases that are involved with setting up and using social media accounts and how the financial conflict of interest law applies. We wanted to do that because the risk of those violations is very severe. It may be less frequent or likely, but it is one that we want agency ethics officials to keep top of mind as they're advising in government employees who are digital managers and those who work in the digital and social media space.
Okay, no, that makes sense to me. So I'm kind of thinking through how this would work in practice. So let's say I own stock in Facebook, and I'm working on our agency's communications team. What are the guidelines that I should be thinking about?
Yeah. So first, what I would say is that it's going to depend on what you're doing. The old adage, it depends. It's going to depend on what you're doing. And in our legal advisory, again, we focused on some of the core things that digital managers do: opening, closing accounts, creating and posting content, because these are things that will iterate over every single day and will apply to the most number of digital managers. But people that work in this space may have opportunities to do a large number of other things. They may include public and private partnerships. They may include facilitating a vacancy announcement through an advertising buy on a social media network. It may be any number of other more one-off things where there's a more financial connection, where there might be less questioning about it, but very clear financial interest if you own stock. particularly for people that are working in this as their primary duty, this is an area where it's good to have a conversation between the ethics official and those individuals, because they may be doing quite a bit more than just opening and closing accounts and posting content. So the risk may be grander, as we might say, as you do more and more work that involves social media and social media companies. So to put it bluntly, it depends, but it's a risk that we want to be mindful of.
Oh, great. That makes a lot of sense to me. Some of the common things that you mentioned, thinking about, say, the conflicts concerns around opening a Facebook account or posting content. How do we distinguish between those two, and how does the analysis differ?
Yeah. So let me start off with opening and closing accounts. And I think this is an area where there's been some historic confusion, and not for any reason that is a problem. When you enter into an account, when you start an account, you are entering into a contract with the social media network. They're providing you a service. They're allowing you to use their network to share information and receive information. And as part of that contract, there's your terms and services that describe any variety of things that the social media network may do with your information, may not do with your information, protections over copyright, and then what happens in the occasion of a dispute. So these all look very similar to our normal contracts that we have. But the user experience is such that your average user is not normally thinking about it the same way as thinking about buying a house and having a contract. So the first thing I want to point out is that when you open and close an account, it is a contract. Now, then the next question is, well, if it's a contract, it's a particular matter under 18 U.S.C. 208, then the question is, if you're participating personally and substantially in opening and closing that account, when do you have a financial interest in that decision that would be disqualifying? And that's what we get into in the legal advisory.
No, great, thank you. In the legal advisory note that opening and closing free accounts might be a little different. Can you explain why we make this distinction, or if I've understood that correctly?
Yeah, exactly. So when we talk about a financial interest in the ethics world, what we're talking about is the potential for a gain or loss. Free accounts are interesting. They're interesting because, as I said, they're contracts. So you say, well, they meet the particular matter standard. If you're opening and closing it, then you're the person entering the contract. You seem to be participating in it. But where's the financial interest? When you enter into those accounts, you are not providing them with any money. They're not requesting any money. It has really no significant financial impact on the organization. They are just adding another account to their already existing servers. So it may be taking up some de minimis space on their servers. The way that social media accounts, particularly those that are in the free account business, as we can say, the way that they make money is largely through third-party contracts with advertisers and others who are seeking to get aggregate data that they can then make decisions on selling other services. When you open or close an account, when we sat down and looked at it, we determined there was no direct or predictable way that you could determine that opening that or closing that account was going to have an effect on those third-party contracts. And that's where we ended up when it comes to free accounts. Now, when it comes to paid accounts or services on a social network that normally provides free accounts, then when those are entered into, they generally require either an additional payment or an expenditure of money on behalf of the social media network to be able to meet you or comply with those. And so in those cases, let's say you have to pay to verify your account. You might open the account. That is a decision that would not necessarily have an impact on the social media account, but then to pay whatever amount of money it is to have a verified account would be a decision in which the organization has a financial, direct and predictable financial interest. I think the last thing I'd say here is that we in the government do not like the terms that every social media network has. And we have been successful in the past with negotiating terms of service that are compatible with federal legal and regulatory requirements. And a number of the major social media accounts have those federated terms of service that have been negotiated largely by GSA in the past. If you're using a social media account, or you want to use a social media account, and the terms of service are not compatible with federal law, if you have to negotiate changes to those terms of service, that also is a decision in which the organization is going to have a financial interest in, because they're going to have to change. Either they might just have to change code, they have to hire lawyers to have a discussion with you. There's a whole number of places where they're expending money to comply with that negotiation and to go through that process. So that is an area as well where even if you have a free account, if you're negotiating the terms of service, as somebody who owns stock in that would have a financial interest in those decisions, because the company would have a financial interest in those negotiations.
Well, that makes sense to me. It seems there's no escaping for doing the elemental analysis under 18 U.S.C. Section 208. That clears up for me, I think, the opening and closing of accounts. But what about some more routine things? What about just creating content? Is that different? Say that I'm preparing to post a tweet or an article that describes an enforcement action. Could I work on that if I own stock in, say, Facebook, and that's where we were doing the posting?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so again, what we've said is that if you're posting something on your social media network and you own stock in the social media network, you're using a service that you've already entered into, like using the telephone services that we have. We've already entered into the contract for those services. And not only that, but it's not, in almost all cases, I mean, we can't say definitively, you know how the world works, but in almost all cases, in general, it's not going to have a direct and predictable effect on the social media networks. Again, they have their money, most of it is coming from these third-party contracts. And as a result, it's really not really understood how it would be at time one that just posting something is going to affect the value of those contracts, or even how people are going to engage with the information, how that might drive money towards advertisers or to other third parties. So what we've said is it's not direct and predictable. In most cases, just posting information online onto the social media network, how that would have an effect on the social media network itself.
Great. Now that makes a lot of sense. Maybe I could change up the facts just a little bit and see if the analysis would change. So now let's say I own stock in the company that's the target of the enforcement action, and I'm drawing up that content. How does that work?
Yeah, a little bit different here. So first off, it kind of depends on what you're doing. So if you're already involved in the enforcement action and you own stock in that company, you're already participating personally substantially in a particular matter in which they have a financial interest. So the fact that you're now going to be announcing it over social media, that's not going to change the fact that you have that underlying conflict. Now, there are people in the digital communications space who are not actually involved in the underlying matters. They're just there to produce content. They're given basically the information that they are to provide. They think about it, they edit it, they discuss what the right format, what right structure is, the right way, the right timing, all of the things that go into what makes a good communication a good communication. And that is not really a central part of the enforcement action. It is a side part. I won't necessarily call it ministerial, but it's a peripheral activity. And as we've noted in our guidance, in our regulations, peripheral activities are not considered direct and substantial participation in the underlying matter. So you're doing budget, right? It's not considered to be participating in the direct in the matter itself. So if you already have a conflict because you work on the enforcement matter, like a change, if you are just doing some of the content moderation pieces or just some of the content creation pieces, again, that's not normally going to raise to the level of being substantial participation that would be disqualifying. Now, there is one caveat here, Patrick, and that caveat is that there are certain people that are very, very high up, decision makers, the ability to make decisions or not make decisions, just effectively by saying them. And we have seen situations where, at least to the outside observer, a decision was made and the only manifestation of that decision was over social media. We're not going to enforce this action on so-and-so. These people are not part of this class. Those types of decisions where it's entangled between the announcement and the action, those decision makers, particularly those with individual accounts, need to be very cautious when they hold stock in companies, to be mindful about what they're doing and how they are doing it, so that they do not, just jump on and say something that will have a financial impact on an outside organization in which they hold stock.
Great, that's helpful. Maybe allay some of the anxiety of people who are called on to format or maybe, edit messages for character counts, those kinds of things. But I do take that there's a little bit of nuance here. But these are some really good guidelines. Do you have any sort of practical tips for, what agencies can do to manage these kind of nuanced issues?
Yeah, I think it's helpful here to think about two additional things. The first is agencies themselves, right, are all structured differently. They hire people differently. They operate differently. The way that they approach social media is very different. So understanding the culture of the organization that you're working in, be able to work with the people who are the content creators or the account owners, getting them on front and understanding these issues is really going to be important. And that's going to be at the agency level to understand where the leverage is and where the nodes of authority and power are in your organization to have the right conversations to make sure that you're on the right side of the line. And I think the last thing I would say is, even in the instance that somebody is not going to violate a criminal law, we are talking about an area where things are very public. And so it is important to consider the appearances of posting content or having somebody involved when they're financially involved in the social network that go beyond just the criminal ramifications. And that's something, again, that agencies are in the best place to make those types of decisions.
No, great. Thank you, Chris. It sounds like we've concluded kind of where we began with that idea of risk, that we need to think of them in a holistic way, that there are a variety of different risks that arise and a variety of different ways different agencies need to manage those risks. So Christy, so now that agency ethics officials have this legal advisory, I'd like to ask you a question about what should they be thinking about and what should they be doing and what steps should they consider taking in order to implement properly this new guidance?
Sure, that is a great question, in response to which I would offer the following considerations. I'd say, one, use the issuance of this legal advisory as an opportunity to revisit your agency's social media policies and procedures and see if those policies and procedures address the considerations that we've raised in the advisory. If they don't, then we would encourage you to update those policies and procedures to mitigate the risk of unintentional ethics violations. Two, try to get ahead of the risk. See if you can prepare training materials and guidance that can be provided when new official accounts are first initiated. Three, I'd say meeting the desires of your agency in a way that is ethical and that appears to be ethical may sometimes require employees to think outside the box. For example, if a reference to a private company in a character-limited tweet would appear to be an endorsement, but with more context would not, maybe prepare a press release that can be linked to in the tweet instead of mentioning the private company. That way you can still use platforms like Twitter to push out content while also ensuring that the appropriate amount of context is also there. And then lastly, I'd say, while there are clear black and white cases, there will also be times when content will straddle the line. Be mindful of how small changes in phrasing can impact interpretation. Try to look at things from the eyes of the public, and if the public would think that the content is an endorsement, then it might be time to redraft.
Excellent. Well, thank you both very much for joining us. This has been a very informative session. I know you're both very busy and your time is very valuable, so I'm grateful for you joining the Institute for Ethics in Government to share your insights with our community. I'd also like to thank all of you listening and watching today. I hope you found this to be a helpful presentation. And as ever, if you have ideas for future presentations, please reach out to your desk officer or any member of the Institute for Ethics in Government team. We exist to meet your professional development needs, and we thank you for your attention today.